Hello there, and welcome. The quiet hours of the night, or perhaps the calm of your day, are just right for a thought that might seem a little strange at first. It's an idea that asks us to step back from the familiar story of our past and to look at it from a very different perspective. Tonight's thought is not about questioning specific dates or debating a particular event. It's about something far more fundamental. It's about the very foundation of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. It asks a big, quiet question. What if the history we hold so dear, the one written in books and taught in schools, is only one possible version of events? What if, in a sense, everything we know about history was wrong? That's a question that can make you feel a bit like a sailor who discovers the map they've been using is incomplete, or a traveller who suddenly realizes they've been walking on a road that wasn't marked on their chart. It's not about finding fault with the historians and archaeologists who have worked for centuries to piece our story together. Their work is a testament to human curiosity and diligence, but every story is shaped by the evidence that survives, and the earth is a place that erases as much as it preserves. It's a place of constant change, a planet of shifting continents, rising and falling seas, and winds that wear down mountains into dust. What if the fragments of the past that have managed to survive are not the whole picture, but only the ones that were durable enough to last? Before we go any further, I'd like to know where you're listening from. Is the night sky visible from your window, or is there sunlight coming through? Maybe you're on a long drive or a quiet walk, or perhaps you're sitting in the one chair that always feels like home. Wherever you are, and whenever it is for you, you and I are meeting in this shared space to consider an idea that might feel a little like a thought experiment, but has the power to change how you see the world. If this journey feels like the kind of company you've been looking for, calm, steady, and curious without being in a hurry, I'd be so grateful if you gave it a like or subscribed. It's a small thing, but it helps keep these quiet conversations reaching new ears, like a little light in a window for fellow travelers. So, let's start by thinking about what history actually is. We tend to think of it as a solid, fixed thing, a series of events and dates and people that are set in stone. But in reality, it's a living, breathing story built from fragments, a piece of pottery found in a buried city, a coin with the face of a forgotten ruler, a faded piece of parchment with words scribbled on it. Each of these is a small, quiet whisper from the past, and our job as modern listeners is to try and hear those whispers and piece them together into a coherent story. But what if there are whispers we can't hear? What if the past is not a book with missing pages, but an entire library that has been lost, with only a few shelves of tattered volumes remaining? Imagine the early human story. We picture our ancestors as simple hunter-gatherers, moving across the landscape in small bands, focused on the daily struggle for survival. We see them picking up stones and chipping them into tools, drawing images on cave walls, and living in a world that was wild and untamed. This is a powerful and true part of our history. It is a story of incredible resilience and ingenuity. But what if those simple hunter-gatherers were not the only story? What if there were other groups or other
another species with a different kind of intelligence, whose way of life left no stone tools or cave paintings behind? What if they were artists who worked in materials that have long since decayed? What if they were storytellers whose words were only ever spoken aloud and have now vanished into the wind? The deeper we go into the past, the more the record fades. The earth is a forgetful host, and its memory works in strange ways. The things that last are often the things that were never meant to. A city built of wood and clay and thatch will vanish in a few centuries, leaving nothing but a slight mound in the earth. A culture that relied on intricate baskets and woven textiles for its art and its identity will leave no traces behind, because those materials will simply return to the soil. Even things made of stone can be swallowed by the slow, grinding processes of geology. Continents collide, and the ground itself is folded and twisted, erasing the evidence of what once was. 1,000,000 years from now, our own cities, with all their steel and concrete, will likely be nothing but a faint, unidentifiable layer of material in the rock. The rest will have been worn down by water, wind, and the slow, restless motion of the planet's crust. So, if we accept that the past is a story told by whatever survived, then we must also accept that the things that didn't survive might hold a very different story. What if there were entire human cultures, perhaps living tens of thousands of years ago, who were just as intelligent as us, but who chose a different path? What if they developed a different kind of technology, one that was not based on using hard materials like stone or metal, but on manipulating the natural world in more subtle ways? Perhaps they had an intricate understanding of botany and genetics, using plants to build their structures and to power their lives.
Perhaps they had a deep knowledge of acoustics and sound, using it to communicate over vast distances. Those things would leave no trace in the archaeological record, but they would still have been a civilization. They would have been a version of humanity that thrived and built, but did so without leaving behind the kind of evidence we are trained to look for. This isn't about suggesting that our history books are full of lies. It's about realizing that they are full of silences. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply a reminder that time is a great eraser. So much of the human story has vanished. We know that because of the few remarkable things that do survive. A single set of footprints found in ancient mud that has now turned to stone. The remains of a single small camp preserved by a sudden flood. These fragments hint at a much larger, more complex world that we can't see. A world that was rich with stories and ideas that have now been lost to us forever. The very fact that we are so lucky to find these things should remind us of all the things we haven't found, and all the things we never will. It should make us feel humble and a little like a detective who has only been given a single clue from a vast and complicated mystery. What if there were great, non-agrarian cultures that were not centered in one place but were migratory? What if their homes were light and easily packed up? Their art was in song and dance, and their history was passed down in complex oral traditions. We would have no way of knowing they existed because we are trained to look for cities and permanent settlements. We are trained to look for the things that last, and so we have created a history that is biased towards cultures that built in stone. We have a history of the durable, but what about a history of the fragile? What about a history of the fleeting? These questions are not meant to unsettle you. They are meant to gently pry open your mind to a wider range of possibilities. They are meant to remind you that the human story is much bigger and much stranger than the one we usually tell ourselves. And in that vast, unknowable history, the possibility of a different kind of intelligence begins to seem less like a fantasy and more like a quiet truth. It's a reminder that the world we walk on has been many different worlds before. It has been warmer and colder. It has been wetter and drier. It has been home to creatures we would barely recognize. And in all that time, in all that change, the potential for consciousness, for dreaming, for building was always there, waiting for the right conditions to take root. Our own path was not inevitable. It was simply the one that happened to take hold. And if it happened for us, it might have happened before. The most difficult thing to accept is that the world might be a more complex and mysterious place than our current understanding allows. It's a bit like living in a house your whole life, knowing every room and every creak in the floor, only to discover one day that there was a secret passage you never noticed. It doesn't make the house less real, it just makes it more interesting. Our history is real, but it might not be the whole story, and the possibility that there is more to it, that there are silent chapters we can only guess at, is not a threat. It's an invitation to look at the world with fresh eyes, to see it not just as a place we occupy, but as a place that has been lived in and loved in and forgotten again and again long before we ever arrived. The Earth's memory is not like ours. Our history is recorded in books, in documents, and in the stories we tell. The Earth's history is written in the ground itself. It's in the layers of rock and sediment that have piled up over millions of years, like pages in a colossal, slow-moving book. And just like any book, some of those pages have been torn out. Entire chapters have been erased by time. A civilization that thrived 100 years ago would have left behind a record of its existence, but it's a record that would be very difficult to read today. It would be a story buried under new layers of soil, shifted by earthquakes, and eroded by millennia of rain and wind. Consider the human record we do have. The oldest human-made structures we can point to are about 12,000 years old. These are the remarkable stone circles and structures of places like Göbekli Tepe. That feels ancient to us, but on a geological timeline it's a mere blink. Think of it this way. The last time the continents were arranged in a way that would feel at all familiar to us was around 60 million years ago. That's a staggering amount of time, a period so long that it's almost impossible to picture. In that time, mountain ranges have risen and been worn down to hills. Oceans have opened and closed. Vast ice sheets have spread across the planet and then melted away. The Earth has not been a stable stage for our history. It has been a constant whirlwind of change. What if there was a civilization that existed in one of those vanished worlds, say 30 or 40 million years ago? Perhaps they weren't human at all, but some other species that evolved an intelligence we'd recognize. A species that used tools, that built things, and that learned to communicate in complex ways. The physical evidence of their existence would be almost entirely gone. We wouldn't find their cities because the ground they were built on would have been folded, melted, and reborn into new rock. We wouldn't find their tools because any material they used would have long since returned to its raw elements, scattered across the planet by the restless motion of the Earth's crust. This is the central idea behind what scientists have sometimes called the Silurian hypothesis, a concept borrowed from science fiction but taken seriously as a thought experiment. It asks a profound question. Could we, from our present moment, detect an industrial civilization that existed millions of years ago, even if there were no direct artifacts left? The answer, surprisingly, is maybe. Our own industrial civilization is already leaving a lasting signature on the planet. We've changed the chemical composition of the atmosphere, leaving behind a spike in carbon that will be detectable for a very long time. We've created unusual mineral deposits from our mining. We've left a thin, detectable layer of radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing across the globe. These are not the kinds of things that get easily erased by the weather. They become part of the geological record itself. So if a pre-human civilization existed, we might not find their buildings, but we might find a sudden, unexplained spike in carbon levels in a layer of rock millions of years old. We might find traces of unusual metals or other industrial byproducts. The challenge, of course, is that the Earth itself is a great producer of unusual phenomena. Volcanoes, meteor strikes, and natural processes can all create similar kinds of chemical anomalies. Separating a natural event from an artificial one would be incredibly difficult, especially when you're looking back across tens of millions of years. And that's the real core of this idea. We are conditioned to look for history in the things we recognize. We look for pottery, tools, and ruins. But what if the true record of the past is in things we have overlooked? What if we have already walked past the evidence of a forgotten civilization without ever knowing it? A strange deposit of a certain metal in a cliff face that we wrote off as a natural phenomenon. An unexpected change in the atmospheric composition of ancient ice that we've classified as a climate shift caused by a volcano. These are not signs of a conspiracy or a hidden history. They're just the quiet, subtle echoes of a past that has been so thoroughly erased that we have lost the very language to interpret its traces. Thinking about this doesn't have to be a scary or unsettling process. Instead, it can be a moment of great humility. We tend to think of ourselves as the first, the only, the pinnacle of intelligence on this planet. But what if we are just one verse in a much longer poem? What if we are a returning melody, a repeating theme in the song of Earth? We know that life has been reshaped again and again by mass extinctions and cataclysmic events. We know that ecosystems can rise and fall in a geological instant. We also know that intelligence itself is not a straight ladder with us at the top. It is a branching network, and evolution has produced it in surprising ways in many different species. So if a civilization existed before us, what would it have been like? Would it have looked anything like ours? That's a question we can only answer with our imagination. Perhaps they were small and they lived underground, using complex networks of tunnels. Perhaps they were enormous and they used their size and strength to reshape the landscape. Or perhaps they were aquatic, living in the deep oceans, building with coral and using sounds to communicate over miles. We don't have the answers, but the act of asking the question itself is what matters. It forces us to acknowledge that our way of being is not the only way, and our history is not the only story. The possibility is enough to make the world feel bigger, richer, and more mysterious. It allows us to look at the deep past not as an empty wilderness, but as a time filled with its own triumphs and tragedies, its own stories and its own quiet moments of contemplation. The continents weren't where they are now. The air might have felt heavier, warmer, or colder. The animals would have been unrecognizable. And somewhere in all that, perhaps there were minds working together, shaping their environment, telling their own stories, and then disappearing before we ever had the chance to meet them. The Earth's crust is not a permanent stage, but a shifting, restless platform. Oceans open and close, swallowing old seabeds and creating new ones. Mountains are slowly ground down into sand and gravel, carried away by rivers and deposited in new layers elsewhere. This constant geological turnover means that any trace of a civilization that existed before us would have had to survive a lot. The odds of that happening are small, and even if some evidence did survive, we would still need to recognize it for what it was. A worked piece of stone from tens of millions of years ago might be dismissed as a natural formation unless it was found in just the right context. A smudge of unusual chemistry in a rock layer might be passed over unless someone thought to look for industrial causes. The more you think about the scale of time involved, the easier it becomes to see how an entire civilization could simply disappear. Imagine a continent covered in forests, dotted with towns and cities belonging to a species that never met us. Over millions of years, sea levels rise and fall, glaciers advance and retreat. Volcanoes erupt and the ground itself buckles and shifts. In the end, almost everything they made is gone. A few stubborn traces are left, maybe buried deep under layers of sediment, maybe trapped in an ancient seabed that has now turned to stone. The rest is as if it never happened. We can point to places where the Earth has held on to a memory for far longer than usual. Fossilized forests where the trees still stand, turned to stone. Insects trapped in amber for tens of millions of years. Footprints pressed into mud and preserved until the mud became rock. These are accidents, moments in time saved by unusual conditions. For a whole civilization to be recorded like that, it would take a remarkable combination of luck and geology. Without it, their existence would slip away into the same silence that has swallowed so many other species. Thinking about this doesn't require us to believe that it happened. It just opens the door to the possibility. And once that door is open, it's hard not to wonder what such a civilization might have looked like. We often imagine intelligence taking the same shape it has in us. Upright posture, hands with fine motor control, eyes that face forward, but those are just the tools our particular body plan offers. Another species might have built its intelligence on entirely different foundations. It might have worked in the water, using fins or tentacles to manipulate its environment. It might have flown, using its perspective from above to navigate and plan. Intelligence is adaptable. It finds ways to express itself through whatever form it has. If there were such a species, its art might have been something we could not recognize. Perhaps they created beautiful sounds that faded into the air, or patterns in the sand that were washed away by the tide. Art is one of the most mysterious signs of intelligence because it's not strictly necessary for survival. It suggests a mind that values beauty or symbolism or the act of creation itself. That is the kind of mind that might have left traces worth finding. Of course, most dreams never leave a physical mark. Even in our own history, the majority of what we think and imagine vanishes the moment we wake. Civilizations leave behind only a fraction of what they create, and that fraction is vulnerable to time. This is where the difficulty of proving such a thing becomes clear. Even in our own cities, built with all the technology we have, the process of decay starts quickly. In a few centuries, the outlines of streets might still be visible from the air. But in a few thousand years, the ground might have swallowed them entirely. In 1,000,000 years, they could be nothing more than faint differences in soil composition. In tens of millions, they might be gone beyond recognition. That is why when scientists consider the possibility of an earlier civilization, they often look for indirect signs. Changes in the chemistry of rocks, sudden shifts in climate that could be linked to industrial activity, deposits of materials that do not occur naturally. These things are less vulnerable to erosion than a building or a tool. They are the geological equivalent of footprints on a very old path. Still, the thought remains. Somewhere, at some point in the Earth's history, it is not beyond possibility that the first minds capable of dreaming in the way we do took the first steps towards something greater. Maybe they lived in small groups at first, scattered across a landscape full of predators and changing weather. Maybe they learned to shelter in caves or to build nests or platforms that lasted beyond a single season. Maybe they began to use fire or some other form of controlled energy. With each step, their world would have changed. And with each change, the gap between their lives and those of the other creatures around them would have grown. The details are unknowable, but the path is familiar. It is the one we walked, and the one that evolution could have laid down more than once. The record of life on Earth is full of gaps, even for species we know existed. Most of the story is missing, with only scattered fragments remaining to hint at what was once there. That is why this idea is so hard to prove or disprove. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply the result of how the planet works. Time is always moving, always reshaping, always covering the traces of what came before. And so we can only imagine the first minds that dreamed, picture them in landscapes that are long gone, hear their voices in sounds we can no longer translate. They might have been nothing like us, or they might have shared more than we expect. The possibility is enough to remind us that our place in history is not guaranteed to be unique. Intelligence may be rare, but it may not be singular. The Earth may have hosted it before, and it may again. From here, the question becomes not just whether it could have happened, but what we even mean when we say civilization. When we use the word civilization, it's easy to picture tall stone buildings, wide roads, and intricate art carved into walls. We think of writing, laws, and governments, of great gatherings of people building something bigger than any single individual. But those are just the familiar examples from our own past. Strip the word down to its essence, and it's not about a specific style of architecture or a particular kind of government. It's about a way of living where knowledge, culture, and technology accumulate over generations, and where that accumulation changes the way a society functions. By that measure, civilization isn't necessarily tied to how a place looks from the outside. A group could live in structures made entirely of natural materials, leaving no grand ruins behind, and still be a civilization if they have organized systems, shared knowledge, and ways of shaping the environment to their needs. We tend to imagine stone monuments because they last the longest, but permanence isn't the true measure. Complexity is. It's also worth noting that civilizations can be small. We often think in terms of empires and vast cities because those are the easiest to spot in our own history. But human civilization didn't start there. It began in scattered communities connected by trade and shared practices, with no central authority binding them together. What made them part of the same broad story was the way they exchanged ideas, passed down techniques, and created a cultural memory that lasted beyond any single lifetime. So if we ask whether there might have been a civilization on Earth before humans, we have to keep that flexibility in mind. It might not have looked like Rome or Mesopotamia. It might not have been based on agriculture. It might have relied on entirely different resources suited to the species that built it. Even the concept of a city might have been different. Perhaps not a dense cluster of permanent buildings, but a network of seasonal gathering places connected by routes that were well known to those who travelled them. One of the biggest challenges in defining civilization is that we tend to measure it by our own standards. We count writing as a major milestone, but writing is just one way of storing and transmitting knowledge. Oral traditions can be highly complex and accurate over long periods of time. We value monumental architecture, but a society could create equally sophisticated achievements in forms that vanish quickly, like woven structures, carved wood, or even arrangements of plants. We admire large-scale engineering projects, but small, precise interventions in an environment can be just as telling. If a non-human civilization existed millions of years ago, It's possible that their way of life wouldn't fit neatly into our categories. They might not have farmed in rows or herded animals in pastures. They might not have left behind pottery or metal tools. They could have worked entirely with organic materials, using techniques that left no obvious trace once those materials decayed. In that case, the evidence of their existence would be more likely to appear as subtle patterns in the landscape, altered waterways, unusual soil compositions, or the sudden appearance of certain plant species far from their native ranges. This is where the definition of civilization matters so much. If we limit it to what we already recognize from human history, we risk missing signs of other possibilities. If we expand it to include any sustained, organized way of life that shapes the environment and preserves knowledge, we open ourselves to a wider range of evidence. That doesn't mean we should call every animal society a civilization. Ants and bees have complex social structures, but they operate almost entirely on instinct, without the kind of cultural evolution we see in humans. The key difference is innovation that builds on itself, producing changes over time that aren't just genetic, but learned and shared. Consider how archaeologists determine whether a past human group was part of a civilization. They look for signs of long-distance trade, specialized labor, symbolic expression, and the ability to support communities larger than the immediate family group. None of these require stone buildings, none require metal. They simply require organization, cooperation, and shared culture. These are the markers that could, in theory, appear in the fossil record of a non-human species, though finding them would be difficult without direct artifacts. There's also the question of how long a civilization needs to last before we consider it significant. Some human civilizations have endured for thousands of years, while others have risen and fallen within a few centuries. In geological terms, even 1,000 years is barely a flicker. But during that time, the impact can be enormous. Forests cut down, rivers diverted, species moved from one continent to another. Those changes can sometimes be detected in sediment layers, giving us hints about activity long after the buildings are gone. If a pre-human civilization lasted long enough to alter ecosystems on a large scale, we might expect to see similar traces, even if we didn't recognize them as such. Of course, one of the dangers of this kind of thinking is that nature itself can produce patterns that look artificial. A perfectly round hill might be the remains of an ancient volcano rather than a constructed mound. Straight lines in rock formations can form through natural fracturing. Even large-scale changes in vegetation could be caused by climate shifts rather than deliberate planting. This means that to identify a true civilization, we would need multiple lines of evidence, changes in the land, unusual material deposits, and possibly even fossilized remains of the species itself. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a quiet invitation to reconsider the story we've been told. It doesn't mean our current history is wrong, but that it might be incomplete. We might be living in a world that has been lived in, built on, and perhaps even loved by others before us. We may never find definitive proof of this. We may never know what happened in the vast, silent chapters of Earth's past, but the possibility is enough to make the world feel a little more magical, a little more mysterious, and a little more alive. This entire thought experiment is an act of humility. It asks us to set aside the idea that we are the only minds to ever wander across this planet, and to imagine a much bigger, much richer story than the one we have told. It's a story that includes not just us, but all the other creatures that came before, and all the possibilities that have been lost to the slow, gentle, and unstoppable passage of time. And in the quiet hours when the house is still and your thoughts wander further than usual, it's a thought that might just quietly settle into your mind and stay there long after you first heard it.